be suffering some severe side effects
Oh.
here in a few moments. So if I become a werewolf or if I keel over, start sweating profusely, that's going to be the reason.
How are you feeling?
Right now I feel great, but they say that when it comes, it hits you like a freight train all at once. That's how it was with the first shot for me. I was frolicking, and then suddenly I felt like I'd been hit by a car.
Really?
Are you sure that's not from the homemade beer?
It could honestly be a lot of things. It could honestly be a lot of things.
Maybe the homemade beer would be the remedy.
I don't think Dr. Fauci is going to go along with that.
I don't know. That's my vote.
Mhm.
I want to say hi to my mom. Hi to my mother-in-law.
Yes.
I was just wondering who the Lynette was. Now I know.
That's my mom. So good evening. We're going to talk a little bit about abortion and Jewish law. Obviously a sensitive topic, but I hope that by looking at some of the sources and by just seeing how the positions in Judaism develop, we're going to empower ourselves to have some more some conversations about this that take note of where the tradition has been and where the tradition is now. It's too often in modern society, we tend to just get to the bottom line of things and just go at each other there. And so I hope that the class is interesting from the point of view about Judaism, but I certainly hope as well that it encourages us to have the sensitive conversations that this issue deserves. I will move to the.
I'll come with your coffee.
Oh, thank you.
Hey, Douglas, I think I'm going to beat you this time.
Like literally?
So my agenda for tonight, I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes if I've timed this well, is I want to explore the history, why there are differences in attitudes towards abortion between Jews and Christians. At least in antiquity, the traditions really have a very different understanding of what's at stake and what fetal life involves. I want to talk a bit about that, even though in Judaism, we confront the fact that the Hebrew Bible and the rabbinic literature does not give us a lot of strong sources to give us any reason whatsoever to prohibit or to regulate abortion, that nevertheless, over time, Judaism did inculcate a prohibitive attitude towards it, though not for the same reasons that it's prohibited by Christians. And I want to explain a little bit about the modern Jewish movements, their attitudes towards abortions, and why the conversations that we tend to have about it seem to be so stunted. Well, all of our conversations are kind of stunted today, but is in sort of, at least in the social media context, you have shouting matches between one party that says that Judaism is pro-choice, another party says that Judaism is pro-life. I think it's important wherever we find ourselves in that argument to have a sense of why that's the case, just in terms of understanding ourselves and understanding our community. The sources that we're looking at today are a little bit, they're a little bit challenging, but I will go through them deliberately, and I'll stop often to solicit feedback, questions, and any concerns that people may have. Going back to the beginning, the first point: why do Christians and Jews have different perspectives? And if to just summarize the difference between those, it's very difficult in Judaism to arrive at the conclusion that Christianity arrives at very easily, which says that abortion is murder. that abortion tends to be prohibited in the more conservative Jewish communities, but it's very rare to see it argued in the way that it's the argument that abortion has to be prohibited because it's the taking of a human life. Yet this is the predominant view, at least in historical Christianity. And the story of how this is the case, it develops that there were really two Jewish views of abortion in antiquity, at least two. There are two Jewish views of just about everything. But the initial divide on the question of abortion, with one camp holding that abortion is murder and another camp holding that it's at most a tort, occurs between two different segments of the Jewish community in mid-antiquity, around the time of the writing of the Christian scriptures. There was a Jewish community in the land of Israel whose language was Hebrew, who read the Bible in Hebrew and were developing a literature of biblical analysis in Hebrew and in Aramaic. But there was also a large Jewish community in the diaspora, particularly in Alexandria, Egypt, which had a Greek tradition of Judaism. The Torah was written in Greek, probably for liturgical purposes. It may have been read in the synagogue in Greek. And the apparatus with which was created to understand these texts was, of course, in Greek and incorporated many aspects of Greek philosophy into the discussion. Starting with the land of Israel, the central text, the text that we come back to over and over in the Bible, and we're talking with the Masoretic text. This is a translation from the Hebrew text that we read in the synagogue. And we're in the 21st chapter of Exodus, the so-called Book of the Covenant, which has a lot of the civil and criminal law that the Hebrew Bible contains. And we read that there's the scenario when two men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues. The one responsible shall be fined according to as the woman's husband may exact from him. And so in inadvertently creating a miscarriage or an abortion is a tort. According to our first reading of this, the payment to be based upon reckoning. But if other damage, and the word for damage as ason, ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. And this is the famous lex talion, the law of retribution, which appears in many parts of the Torah. As this text appears in the Hebrew tradition, in the Jewish Masoretic tradition, it's difficult to make the case that abortion would be anything but a tort. And if there's the clause, but if other damage ensues, seems to be referring back to the woman, that if there is the fight between two men and they inadvertently harm a woman, there's a miscarriage, the unintentional abortion itself is a tort, but there's the further possibility of a tort for damage to be done to the woman, for any damage that was done to the woman. And we have the lex talion, life for life, eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. In rabbinic thinking, in the Jewish worldview of the land of Israel, this is almost always refers to financial compensation. That the rabbis are very clear that this trope is not to be taken literally, that it's not calling us to like put out an eye or to remove a tooth. That compensation, it has to be equitable. It has to be equivalent to the damages done. And this is the way that the text was read in the land of Israel and in Hebrew. In the Greek diaspora in Alexandria, there was, as I said, there was a version of the Torah that was written in Greek which goes on to be identified as the Septuagint. And when we translate the Greek of this version into English, we have it's radically different. When two men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if it is perfectly formed, the word ason, which when we in Hebrew and is understood by the rabbis to mean to be additionally damaged, in Greek, it's translated, but if it is perfectly formed and refers clearly in this case to the fetus, and it says the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. The diaspora community did not necessarily have the tradition that developed in the land of Israel that the lex talion was about financial compensation. And so you have in the Greek translation of the scripture, the proposition that in addition to the tort that could be exacted by damage to the woman, that there is the possibility that if the fetus is perfectly formed, there is a penalty for that, and that penalty could be literally life for life. It would literally be talking about a capital case here. And so you have one community in the land of Israel which reads this verse to understand abortion as a tort. And you have the other community in Alexandria which reads it as to understand abortion to be murder. And these are the two poles within Judaism. Christianity is going to inherit the second one. Christianity is going to inherit the translation and the understanding of the Greek Jewish community. And the rabbis are going to inherit the understanding of the Eretz Israel community of the Jews in the land of Israel. And so these two Jewish communities have different views about the ultimate value of the fetus and the reason for the prohibition of abortion. One of those which goes to the rabbis, and the one from the Greek world goes to the Christians, which goes to the Christian position that we recognize as that we recognize today, that the recognition in that worldview that abortion is tantamount to murder, and that we can understand the fetus as as being counted as a human life. To just underline this, Philo of Alexandria, who was a great Jewish thinker and incorporated a lot of Greek philosophy into his writings, writes very clearly in his explanation of the scripture, but if anyone has a context with a woman who is pregnant and strikes her with a blow on her belly and she miscarries, if the child which was conceived within her is still unfashioned and unformed, he shall be punished by a fine, both for the assault which he committed, but also because he has prevented nature, who was fashioning and preparing the most excellent of creatures, a human being, from bringing him into existence. But if the child which was conceived had assumed a distinct shape in all of its parts, having received all of its proper connective and distinctive qualities, he shall die. The person who caused the child to die shall die. For such a creature as that is a man whom he has slain while he is still in the workshop of nature, who had not thought it as yet a proper time to produce him to the light, but had kept him like a statue lying in a sculptor's workshop, requiring nothing more to be released and to be sent out into the world. And Philo's position was a Jewish position. He was probably the greatest sage of this Jewish community. But this is the tradition that gets passed on to Christianity. And the tradition that we associate with the rabbis is the different position, and does not view the fetus as something that can be murdered. And if you're thinking that there aren't practical implications for this in politics, the nub of this can be understood with a really weird development in the presidential debates that occurred in the year 2000. And this is the article from the New York Times, Gore and Bush duel on an odd death penalty question. The question that was put to them, both of them favored capital punishment. The question was, well, if there's a woman on death row who is pregnant, do you delay the execution until she can have the baby so that you don't kill the fetus along with the woman? These two communities both evaluate these questions, and they had different answers. For those of you keeping score in our time, Bush took the view of Philo that said that he would delay the execution because the fetus has life. And Gore took a different position. But Philo, indeed, and it appears to me that some lawgivers, having started from this point, have also promulgated the law about condemned women, which commands that pregnant women, if they have committed any offense worthy of death, shall nevertheless not be executed until they have brought forth, until they have given birth, in order that the creature in their womb may not be slain with them when they are put to death. The rabbis take the opposite position. It says explicitly in the Mishnah, in the case of a pregnant woman who is taken by the court to be executed, the court does not wait to execute her until she gives birth. Rather, she is killed immediately. But with a regard to a woman who is taken to be executed who sat on the travailing chair, that's the chair that you sit in to have a baby, apparently. In the throes of labor, if the woman's in labor, then the court waits to execute her until she gives birth. And in this contrast, we have the competing points of view that in Christianity, that the fetus was seen as something that was of a human being potentially after it was formed to a recognizable human form within the woman. And therefore, you would have to postpone the execution. But for the rabbis who saw the fetus as entirely subordinate to the woman, a limb of the woman, ubar erech isha, as it's spoken to sometimes, that because the fetus is subordinate to the woman, you can't wait for the fetus to be born in order to execute the woman, but your job is to therefore proceed with the execution right away. And this is and all of this is in line with the first point that I wanted to make, understanding the historical differences between Judaism and Christianity on abortion. But I will stop here and take any questions and make any clarifications that people would hold that we should make. So the shot made me deaf. I can't hear anything. Was this old hat was this news to anyone?
Actually, the Philo attitude was news to me. Because of course we lived in Israel, and I worked on a women's floor in a government hospital, and we did abortions all the time. But I never, even of the people that were hesitant, I did not know that Philo opinion, generally speaking, was more the second, the rabbi's attitude. So I did not know that. That was interesting.
Only philosophers tend to study Philo, so that's it's not. It's not the sort of thing that really is you're going to have a discussion on the subway about. Hey, I was reading my Philo last night, and you'll never guess what I read.
But was this ever a very popular point in Jewish history, or was it more the rabbi's attitude that was the more prevailing attitude there?
I'm sorry. Could you say that question again?
Philo's attitude towards, unborn life, was it ever popular during after he died during Jewish history? I mean, was it, or was the second attitude, by the Talmudic or the rabbis, isn't that been the more prevalent attitude in Judaism?
Philo almost completely disappears from the Jewish radar, and he is taken up by the Christians and used by Christians in such a way that many of them were actually convinced he was a Christian.
Okay.
That it was a completely. I mean, the reason for the separation is not clear, but a clear candidate is language. That the rabbinic tradition is going to focus intensely on Hebrew as the language of Judaism, and it is not going to necessarily take seriously something that's not written in the language that we are working in. Philo becomes invisible. There are rabbis in the 20th century, several of them at Yeshiva University, that tried to rehabilitate Philo for Jews, to try to show the connections between Philo and certain midrashim and certain writings. But even Philo was historically a Jew, a proud Jew, but he was really taken up more by the Christian cause than by the Jewish cause.
Okay, thank you.
Rabbi, is there any sense of which, if the Septuagint translation is older than the Masoretic text, or the reverse? Is there
Our assumption is in most cases that the Masoretic text is prior, but there's always the possibility that the Masoretic text was edited or changed in response to popular readings in the Septuagint, or in places where the Masoretic text was not clear, the Septuagint could be relied on for people to help understand what was in the Masoretic text. But our assumption, both as Jews and and from the Academy, is that we don't know if there ever was a single source document that was the father of all documents of the Torah, but our belief is that the Masoretic tradition was closer to that than the Septuagint.
Uncle say here.
Rabbi, I'm wondering if in Greek philosophy you find a similar attitude to the texts in Alexandria. If that text were influenced by Greek philosophy.
Many scholars think that both sides are influenced by Hellenistic schools, but by different Hellenistic schools. That it was the thought of Plato and the Pythagorean guys. So the side effects are kicking in. I'm losing the ability to pronounce things. But Plato believed that the fetus was of value. The Stoics did not. And sometimes we look at the rabbis as the heirs of Stoicism. Pirkei Avot is understood to be a text with a lot of Stoic influences. Rabbi Akiva seems to be strongly influenced by the Stoics. And many people try to understand the difference between the two camps as allegiances to different Hellenistic philosophical schools. That there were Platonic philosophical schools that were opposed to abortion, and there were Stoical philosophical schools that were not, and the latter was the inspiration for the rabbis, and the former would be the inspiration for Philo, who was Neoplatonic in just about any way you could be Neoplatonic.
Okay, thank you.
Josh asked me, what did Onkelos say? And I'm embarrassed to say, I don't know. I will look it up after. The Onkelos is the Aramaic Targum of the Torah. And I will look that up, but I don't know that. So the next thing I need to understand, I want to explain, is that you could almost end the argument here, and sometimes in modern conversations it feels like we do end the argument here. That's to say that, well, you can sort of set up a syllogism, and I don't know, it's not airtight, but you say, well, Christians prohibit abortion because they believe it is murder. Jews do not believe that abortion is murder. Therefore, Jews permit abortion. It's not airtight logically, but it's we don't always do things airtight logically. But that's the way a lot of the modern conversation goes, and that's reasonable to a point. But we have to account for the fact that even though the rabbis had a dramatically different view of abortion than Christianity did, that in large parts of Jewish thought abortion ends up prohibited as well, but for other reasons. And it's to explain that I wish to turn to at the moment. And I'm going to give you 3 more texts. I'm sorry for all the text. They say that every text you give, you lose you lose ratings with every one. But I will endeavor to make this as interesting as I can, and to show why I feel like these texts need to be brought forward. We have a teaching from the Mishnah and the Talmud that says the daughter of a priest who has a Kohen, who has relations with a non-Kohen, an Israelite, continues to eat truma. If she becomes pregnant, though, she may no longer eat it. So what is truma? Truma is the tax we pay to the Kohanim in the land of Israel in biblical times. 2% of produce goes to the Kohanim. Believe it or not, some people thought that was exorbitant in those days. I mean, I think we would love to pay a 2% tax these days. So, but the only people that are allowed to eat the truma are the Kohanes. Non-Kohanim are not allowed to eat it. The daughter of a priest is allowed to eat the truma so long as she is in her father's house. But if she marries an Israelite, a non-Kohen, she is no longer entitled to eat the truma. And the Mishnah asks, well, what if the daughter of a Kohen has intercourse with a non-Jew and possibly becomes pregnant? The fetus that's developing inside her is not a Kohen and is not entitled to eat the truma. So at what point do we worry about this woman eating the truma if she's carrying a fetus that is not a Kohen? And the Gemara exclaims, if the priest's daughter were married to an Israelite who died, while she was married to the Israelite, she would not be permitted to eat truma. But if he dies, she could eat truma later that evening. She immerses herself and she's back in her father's house, but she can eat the truma. Rav Kista said she should immerse herself and then eat truma until the 40th day after conception. For if she was then found not to be pregnant, then she was never pregnant. And if she was found to be pregnant, it is considered to be mere water until the 40th day. And in contemporary discussions about Judaism and abortion, we hear this source all the time. And it's a famous thing that for 40 days, the fetus was considered to have no existence, even a subordinate instance to the mother, that was so formless that we don't even have to worry about it until that point. After that point, it does have an existence which affects the woman ritually, but it is still in every way subservient to her, as we look at some other sources. Another famous source, and this is one which a lot of the arguments eventually are going to hang on and hinge on, is from Mishnah Ohalot. And it describes the procedure. I recognize that there's some controversy exactly how one should describe this. I tend to describe it as a partial birth abortion, even though there's, as I said, I don't know the precise correct way to say this. But the source says that if a woman is having trouble giving birth, they cut the child up in her womb and bring it forth limb by limb. This is what's being described here as a therapeutic abortion, because her life comes before the life of the child. But if the greater part has come out, and this is generally understood to be if the head of the child has been delivered, one may not touch it, for one may not set aside one person's life for that of another. And this is in keeping with the Mishnah that we read before, that it's really up until the moment of childbirth that we wait until we rabbinically, before we describe any importance as a human life to the fetus, to the point where we would have to weigh it against the mothers. Prior to birth, we are permitted to dismember the fetus inside if it's endangering the mom. And we don't have a concern at that point about the whether it's independent, because it's, according rabbinically, it's subordinate. It's like surgery to remove the limb of a woman that's endangering her life. But if the greater part has come out, at that point, one may not set aside for one person. At that point, it's considered to be a human being, and that's the moment that you have to give it the consideration that you would give to the mom's life. And so this source is important, and we're going to see that all of the arguments that go forward in the Middle Ages and modernity come back to this source. But it's significant because it's a source that deals directly with therapeutic abortion, and it emphasizes the rabbinic philosophy that the fetus is always a part of the mom, subservient to her, and that even up until the moment where delivery is happening, we can without hesitation destroy and kill the fetus in order to protect the mother's life. The third source I want to share with you, I want to do so just simply out of a sense of completeness, because it's anomalous, but it shows, because it's different than the other sources, it shows up in a lot of context and discussions about abortion. And this is from the Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin. And at this point in Sanhedrin, they're discussing about the legal system that non-Jews live under. In rabbinic political thought, the legal systems for Jews and non-Jews are completely different. That the legal system for Jews is set out in the Torah and in the explanations of the rabbis. The legal system for non-Jews, what they are obliged to do, is set up in something called the 7 Noahide commandments, which are 7 basic commandments: do not murder, do not steal. But the most important one is that non-Jews are considered under Torah law to be responsible for having a legal system. And this legal system needs to include capital punishment. That capital punishment, that the priority to preserve life is so important that even that non-Jews are required to honor the biblical sense that there needs to be capital punishment in the case of deliberate murder. And so in discussing what the Noahide, or what the laws for non-Jews are to be, it's stated in Sanhedrin. It is stated that in a book of Agadot, of Midrashim, the sages said in the name of Rabbi Ishmael, a descendant of Noah, that's to say a non-Jew, is executed even for killing fetuses. The Gemara asks, what's the reason for the opinion of Rabbi Ishmael? It's anonymous. It's anomalous. It doesn't agree with our other sources. The Gemara answers, it is derived from that which is written, one who sheds the blood of a person, by a person, his blood shall be shed. And it reads it very closely, and I won't go through the Hebrew, but it's kind of a play on words. The word ba'adam literally means in a person and is interpreted homiletically. What is the person that is in a person? You must say this is a fetus that is in its mother's womb. Accordingly, a descendant of Noah, that's to say a non-Jew, is liable for killing a fetus. And the upshot of this, the implication for what this means for Jews is not clear, because as I've said, we do live under completely different legal systems, even though non-Jews are required to have capital punishment. And Jews were permitted through our exegesis and our interpretation of law to design a legal system where capital punishment is next to impossible. So on the one hand, you can't make the leap that because performing an abortion is a capital offense for a non-Jew, because it's murder, that it would be the same situation for a Jew. It's also kind of hard to explain why that would not be the case. But because this source is at odds with the sources that I've shown you and many other sources in the Talmud, because it's at odds with them, it just tends to be neglected. But it's there to be used by those that wish to have a conservative or a prohibitory stance of abortion, even for Jews. And I wanted to share that with it. I think that my inclinations and my leaning on this issue are pretty well known, and that's to say they're pretty liberal. But because of that, I always want to work harder to make sure that I bring forward the data that would allow the other side to make its case as best as they could. And this is a rabbinic source that is at odds with the ethos of much of the rabbinic presentation about abortion in the rest of the Torah. I have one more step to make before we go to modern times. And the theme of this, I want to explain how abortion in medieval and modern times tended to arrive at a prohibitory stance on abortion. And of course, this isn't a class with Rabbi Siemers if we don't talk about the great eagle, the man who saw everything and ruled over everything, Moses Maimonides, born in 1138 and died in 1204. And we're going to have to talk about Maimonides, and his adversary in this is going to be another great Torah sage, Rashi, Shlomo ben Yitzchak, who if Catherine slot is here. I apologize for butchering the French trois, France, 1040 to 1105. Both of my parents know French. It seemed to escape me somehow. But the text that they're going to disagree on how to read is this text that we just read from Ohalot. And this is the case of therapeutic abortion, that if a woman is having trouble giving birth, they cut up the child in her womb and bring it forth limb by limb, because her life comes before the life of the child. But if the greater part has come out, one may not touch it, for one may not set aside one person's life for that of another. Rashi is the greatest commentator on the Talmud in Ashkenaz. And when he, in his commentary on this, his explanation, he writes that it is removed limb by limb. For as long as the being did not come into the world, it is not a nephesh. It is not a life, and it is permitted to kill it to save its mother. But if the head has emerged, it may not be harmed. But because it is considered as fully born, one may not take the life of one nephesh in favor of another. In this commentary, Rashi underlines the conclusion of the rabbinic literature, which is that therapeutic abortion is permitted. But he provides strongly the suggested reason for that, is that as long as the fetus is inside the mother, we do not consider it to be a nephesh. We do not consider it to be a life. And so, which raises the inference that even in the case of a non-therapeutic abortion, we might not need to be that concerned about it, because there is no strong prohibitory text in the Hebrew Bible or in the rabbinic literature. And Rashi is following that consensus, and he's following the rabbinic worldview. Maimonides takes a different path. And in order to explain the path that Maimonides takes, I have to explain the concept of the rodef, or the pursuer. A rodef, or a pursuer, is somebody who's pursuing someone with murderous intent. The Talmud is very averse to capital punishment for criminals that we convict, but it's recognized that even with that reluctance for a court to impose capital punishment, that in the instance that one human being is pursuing another human being with murderous intent, we are permitted, and we are perhaps obligated to use lethal force to stop that person. And it's this category that Maimonides introduces into his understanding of this Mishnah about therapeutic abortion. And he writes this in his Mishnah Torah, his great compilation of Jewish law. He says, this too is a negative commandment not to have compassion on the life of the pursuer, on the rodef. If somebody is moving to kill another human being, you cannot turn away. You cannot be compassionate. You cannot overlook that. Therefore, the sages ruled that when a woman has difficulty in labor, it is permitted to dismember the fetus within her, either by drugs or by surgery, because the fetus is like a rodef, pursuing her to kill her. But once the head has emerged, the fetus may not be harmed, for we do not set aside one life for another, and this is the natural course of the world. A little flourish by Maimonides there. By putting the question of abortion into the category of rodef, which is a move the Talmud considers but refuses to do, Maimonides permits therapeutic abortion, but he also raises the possible inference that in the case that the fetus is not a rodef, that in the case that the fetus is not a pursuer, then we might not be permitted to do an abortion. That's to say that the possibility is raised by Maimonides that therapeutic abortions are permissible, but non-therapeutic abortions would not be permissible. And all of Jewish opinion from that time until today really organizes itself around these two poles: the understanding of the Mishnah by Rashi, who emphasizes that as long as the fetus is inside the woman, it is not a life, and therefore the therapeutic abortions are permitted, but maybe we don't even have to worry about any prohibition against abortion. It's unclear why we would want to forbid any abortion under the rabbinic literature. And so that's the lenient position on the question of abortion that many poskim take in the Middle Ages up through modernity. But there's also the tendency of those poskim, of those decisors, to follow Maimonides, who would argue, or he's understood to be saying, that therapeutic abortions are permitted when the fetus has the status of rodef. That's when it threatens the life of the mother. And it can be inferred from this framing that abortion is forbidden when the fetus is not a rodef, when the mother's life is not in danger. And most of the controversy that we have, even to this day, is the question of whether our allegiance is to follow the understanding of Rashi of this piece of the Talmud, or are we loyal to the great eagle Maimonides with his understanding of it. That we have, there's two possible ways to organize Jewish thought. One is to say that there's almost no hesitation or bar to any sort of abortion because there's not a clear rabbinic mandate or a clear biblical mandate to protect the life of the fetus. We also have the position of Maimonides, which gives authorities some greater grounds on which to prohibit abortions that are not therapeutic in nature. And neither of those camps, neither of those has to resort in any way, shape, or form to the Christian point of view that what's going on here is a murder. I mean, things that aren't murder can still be prohibited, but we do find in Maimonides' position grounds for banning non-therapeutic abortions, and Maimonides is very influential because he is Maimonides. We see representatives of this camp going into modern times, very famously following Rashi. We have people like Eliezer of Oldenburg, the Tzitz Eliezer, a great posek in Jerusalem, whose opinions on abortions were extremely lenient, allowed abortions in most cases because we don't have Mekorot, we don't have sources that say that we have to deny them, that the rabbinic position, that it's in the position of Rashi, can be relied on in almost every instance to permit an abortion to be given. But we also have very prominently for the American community, in the American community, probably the greatest American posek of all time, Moshe Feinstein, who follows the position of Maimonides and almost ends up at a Christian pro-life position. He doesn't necessarily, he stops just short of forbidding abortion because he feels that abortion is tantamount to murder. And he relies on the position of Maimonides, and he relies on the positions of what I described to you as sort of a odd rabbinical text. And he makes the inference that, well, if we have this rabbinical text that forbids non-Jews from performing abortions, why can't we assume that that applies to Jews as well? But within both modern halakhic decisors and throughout the Middle Ages, there's this organization under these two camps in the traditional world, a very lenient camp for abortion and a more restrictive camp for abortion. And so the final piece of this is to explain kind of the denominational positions on abortion. The goal of this second part was to show how, even though there's not a strong rabbinic mandate to being restrictive on abortion, we've never nevertheless arrived at a position where people feel like they have the grounds halakhically to take that position because Maimonides took it. And that because of this, there is some diversity in Jewish thought on the question of abortion that goes through the ages as therapeutic abortion becomes more common, and as screening techniques for diseases become more available, the decisions on whether those procedures are permissible, it comes down to whether you're in Rashi's camp or in Maimonides' camp. And before I go to sort of the modern positions on it, I'll just stop here and take any questions that people have.
Your French pronunciation was just fine.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
It makes sense to me that in pre-modern times, it was all about, does the pregnancy threaten the life of the mother because so many more women died in childbirth than today. And today the issues are so much more diverse than the life of the mother. You know, are the parents going to be able to afford to raise the kid? Do we know about what's the condition of the fetus before it's born? I mean, there are so many more issues. It's not just about the life of the mother.
I think that that's very interesting because there is, I think you could compare the Christian and Jewish positions. I mean, the Jewish positions are all concerned about what the mother is allowed to do and what not to do, and what are the barriers to her health. What are the challenges to her health that the fetus is going to present? Even the question of whether you should coerce a woman to give birth to a fetus that has a severe genetic disease. In Jewish sources, those things are spoken of as how does that affect the mother? How does that affect her health? Being confronted with raising a child who's going to have so many needs and is going to possibly, in the case of something like Tay-Sachs, not going to have a very long life. So in Jewish sources, it tends to go back to the status of mom and what she can do. In the Christian sources, it tends to be it tends to go back to the fetus. How do we understand the moral worth of the fetus? How do we understand the humanity of the fetus? And so because of the different emphasis, those two traditions tend to talk past each other. We have the challenge today that we know quite a bit more about fetal development than was known previously. Again, I take the liberal view of abortion myself, but when I read the rabbinic source that says that for 40 days it's mere water, it's nothing of value, I don't think that's correct. From what we know about it, that the fetus, even from the zygote to the cell different, when it just starts to differentiate, it's a miracle. It's wonderful. And that doesn't necessarily, I don't think that compels me to take a prohibitive stance on abortion, but it certainly challenges a mindset that looks only at the mother, simply because we know more and more about the fetus. And in many ways, the fetus is at the center of the concern, even among non-religious people, than it was in the past. I don't do this, and I don't recommend people do this, but many people take the ultrasound photo home from the ultrasound, they put it on the Facebook, they give it a name, and they start to relate to it as though it's a human being, and it's a human being. When my wife was pregnant, we thought about the fetus not as a fetus, but as a human being, and that's because we know part of that is we're projecting something onto it, but part of it is that we know more about it. So I think that the fact that the conversations in modernity tend to come down to the fetus, and that we know more and more about how wonderful, what a miracle fetal development is, it's a challenge to our point of view. But on the other hand, I think it's appropriate for us to challenge the point of view that it's all about the fetus. I think that it's a strength of Judaism that we can bring the Mekurot and the sources that say, well, that the story of mom here is also, and her health is also fundamental and important. But it's really shifting frames of reference.
Now, what is the halacha saying about, in the case of a rape, about abortion? And also I want to ask, in the case of if the woman was hurt by somebody when she was pregnant, the husband has the say or has the right to consider what will be the recompensation. Is it also today? Do they give the right to the husband in the law today in Israel?
Well, no. Jewish law is not the civil law in Israel. The civil law in Israel is from the common law. It's mostly from Britain, And the laws that were inherited by Israel were first prohibitory because the common law prohibited abortion. But then, like most countries in the West, over time, Israel liberalized their laws, and so the civil law in Israel is not the same as rabbinic civil law, which is in modern times not usually considered to be in force. To go back to the first question, the question of rape, usually those issues get folded back into the questions of maternal health. I mean, rather than make a judgment that that a child conceived by rape is less worthy, the consideration of Jewish sources on that point is, well, what does it mean to maternal health? And how devastating, how negative would it be to coerce a woman to give birth to? What would the effects of a woman's health be to coerce her to give a birth to a child that was conceived by rape? And I think to imagine that that's a very serious challenge to her health, and that's a situation that would call for leniency and liberalism. We turn then to the final part of this, is to try to explain the state of play today. And to understand this, we have to invoke a little bit of sociology. The people who study the history of halacha, and they note that how Jewish law changes in the ages, we always recognize that the answers that we give are dependent on the context that we have to give those answers. The answers that I give in my office to a woman who has this agonizing choice are not the answers that I give in a class to people that even though I'm close to, it's not an emergent situation. And I might give a different answer. I might give a different presentation if I was speaking mostly to non-Jews, trying to explain our position. That the context in which halakhic decisions are made is important. And with modernity, and particularly in the past 5 decades or so in America, a different type of halakhic address has taken place, where where legal authorities are not addressing individuals, and they're not addressing the Jewish world as a whole, but you're addressing your denomination. You're addressing the people that are in your camp, and you tend to answer your questions in a way that is going to support not just what your sense of what the halakha is or what you think is right for them, but what serves the sense of community and cohesion in that particular environment. And so even though prior to the rise of denominations in Judaism, there were divergent opinions. They weren't necessarily organized, well, Ashkenazim are here, Sephardim are here. People were either talking to their own individual communities, or they were speaking to the Jewish community at large. Starting in the 50s in America, rabbis are speaking not to the community at large, but they're speaking to their camp. If you're an Orthodox rabbi, you're speaking to what you want the Orthodox Jews to hear and do. If you're a conservative and Reform rabbi, you're speaking to that particular camp. And what happens in that environment is that a situation where there were diverse understandings of the halakha within a given community, that the opinions tend to migrate around denominational poles. And that in America, the more conservative positions tend to migrate to the Orthodox side, and the more liberal positions tend to migrate to the liberal side. And so you have the situation where in the conservative and in the Reform communities, it's very common to take the position following Rashi and the decisors that follow him. And so the analysis in this community is to say, well, that we're in the liberal camp. Therapeutic abortions are permitted, and our concept of what constitutes a therapeutic abortion is going to be rather broad. And even if we hold that abortion in some circumstances is prohibited, because of the community that we're speaking to, where there's going to be a tendency to elide that sort of thinking. If you read the reform and conservative response on abortion before the 80s, they are decidedly more conservative than the reform and conservative response after the 80s. And before the 80s, they say, we're in the liberal camp. But what the liberal camp means to that group of people is that we permit therapeutic abortions and we generally discourage abortions that that can't be construed as being therapeutic. The following the as we get into the 80s and 90s, and there are many things that cause this change, the second part of that tends to fall off. We say that, well, abortion is permitted under these therapeutic circumstances. We don't really talk about the fact that there is this current of Jewish law, that there are authorities in Jewish law that prohibit abortion in non-therapeutic contexts. In the Orthodox world, they tend to organize themselves around the other pole. It's sociological. All of these things are sociological. I mean, one of the reasons that Maimonides might have taken the position that he took was because he wanted to reform Judaism. He wanted to match what was going on in Judaism with what was going on in the wider Islamic milieu that he found himself in. And part of what made Orthodox Judaism stand out, part of the way that Orthodox Judaism saw ourselves, is that, well, we're resisting all of the changes of the sexual revolution. And so in Orthodoxy, the position is more along the lines of Maimonides. Yes, we do permit therapeutic abortions. We do encourage genetic testing prior to marriage or prior to getting pregnant, but non-therapeutic abortions are prohibited. And by the way, we're going to prohibit genetic testing of the fetus because that's going to lead to an abortion too. So the different denominational communities in America tend to have different bottom lines halakhically on the question of, are there circumstances in which abortion can be considered to be prohibited? I mean, one very interesting phenomenon of the American Jewish community is that doesn't really translate into division among the pro-life and the pro-choice poles that we find in American societies. I mean, having worked in both communities, and I've worked in communities where abortion was considered to be prohibited. I've worked in communities where the arguments of abortion were more liberal. In both of those communities, there's a real hesitance to permitting the state a role in forbidding one role or another. Though the Orthodox, I mean, maybe they incline a little more to the pro-life position, but by and large, it's a relatively stable position in Orthodox Judaism, is that we prohibit abortion as a matter of Jewish law, but we don't particularly care for the secular authorities to tell us that we have to do that. That we see this as a decision that we should be making and that we should be empowered to make. And I think that there's one aspect of that, and there's also, I think that there's the barrier between Jewish and Christian conceptions of abortion. Even the more conservative, as I mentioned, even the more conservative positions on abortion in Judaism do not usually understand abortion as being a homicide, as being a murder, as being something that would rise to the level of rhetoric in which the pro-life position in America is generally couched. The pro-life position in America generally flows from the understanding that abortion is some form of murder, and therefore it needs to be prohibited. That doesn't match with the Jewish understanding of why abortion is prohibited. And so even within the competing community halakhic understandings of abortion within the Jewish community, there seems to be more unity in terms of the question of pro-life or pro-choice. Do we want the government setting the tone for all of us to decide? That I think that's seen as treacherous by large parts of the Jewish community. But then I think that I think that's a more nuanced way to look at it, and to whether say, well, is Judaism pro-life or pro-choice, or how do we do this? We have a diversity of views within Judaism, but a diversity of views within Judaism that are almost all of them at odds with a rhetoric of abortion that seeks to prohibit abortion because it's to be understood as murder. And that's it. It's 9 o'clock. I think I did all of the three things I promised to talk to you about. I will stay on for further questions, observations, and or just wait for the Moderna vaccine to kick in.
Rabbi, a friend asked me what our take on stem cells, use of stem cells worse, and they obviously, my Christian friends have the connective tissue. That's an elegant choice of words between stem cell use and abortion, or the idea that an embryo is a human life. Would it be fair to say that our law on abortion is actually divorced from whether or not it's acceptable to use stem cells in Jewish law? I mean, is that treated separately, a separate issue for us?
I think that there are authorities that are. I don't know if stem cells involve additional abortions. I don't. That's my own ignorance on that topic. If it does involve additional abortions, I think that there would be voices on the conservative side that would be hesitant to do that. But there is, I mean, but in general, Jews tend to be more pro biomedical research than a lot of other groups are. And there's certainly not the strong agitation in Jewish circles against it that you find in pro-life Christian communities.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi,
I was thinking of.
in your use of the term therapeutic abortions, what's included in that definition, in your definition? Is it everything from saving the life of the mother to the couple deciding they can't afford another child? What's included?
My position and the position of other Jews in the lenient camp is that the question of whether an abortion is therapeutic is a question on which the mother is the expert. That's not the universal approach to it. I mean, the reason that you have so many response of this is that there's no, I mean, you rabbis argue about, was this therapeutic? Is this not therapeutic? What are the terms under which we would permit abortion if we only permit therapeutic abortions? I mean, clearly, if that's your position, that has to be hashed out. My general practice, my general point of view of this is that the person who's the expert on whether or not an abortion can be considered to be therapeutic is the woman.
Rabbi, I was thinking through this discussion, another passage in Torah, in Parsha Mishpatim, there's the case where two men are quarreling, and they accidentally hit a pregnant woman, and she miscarriages. And it says, if the woman doesn't die, then all that the person who hit her is liable for is just monetary damages. But there's no concept that he committed murder because he caused her to miscarry. But if the woman dies, then he pays life for life, etc. And I wonder if that's ever brought up also as a notion that it's not considered murder if you or a manslaughter if you accidentally cause someone to miscarry.
Did you make it in late, David?
If you could, that the life.
We started with that text.
Oh, I came in very late. I came in halfway.
I mean, you and I can hash that out on. We can hash that on our own effort.
I'll have to watch the rerun recording.
Judy,
I have a question. I always thought that the idea that life didn't really start until the 8th day after birth, and that's when the bris was. had something to do with the Jewish attitude toward abortion also.
There are halachas that say that a newborn baby is somewhat of a doubtful status. I mean, for instance, a stillborn baby or a baby that dies in the first week technically is not mourned under Jewish law. You don't have the mourning customs attached to that traditionally. I mean, one thing that I would hasten to add that in modern time, I mean, particularly in the conservative movement, but I think the reform movement as well, we don't really go under that. If somebody has a stillbirth and so somebody is, God forbid, a baby dies that's a few days old, our pastoral practice and our halakhic worldview is to treat that as the death of as we would any child, the age of that child notwithstanding. But there are rabbinic texts that try to define human life as, well, when does it really begin? When are you really liable for this and that? But it's unmistakable. The Talmud says explicitly that you can murder a baby that's an hour old. You can murder a baby that's 45 minutes old. You can't murder for most positions of Judaism. You can't murder a baby that's going to be born in 3 hours.
So this other did not have anything to do with abortion.
I'm sure everything's connected to everything. It's there is, but in terms of the big picture, there is the line that all parties tend to agree on is that when murder is possible is postpartum and not prepartum. Well, thank you for joining me tonight. Again, my hope for a talk like this, I hope that the sources are helpful. I hope that it presents a fuller picture of the Jewish view of this. But I hope that we challenge ourselves to. There are pro-life Jews, there are pro-choice Jews. I hope that looking at it this way, it enables us to have conversations in a way that sketch out our side with the knowledge that there's a different side from ours, that there's a heritage to all different positions on this, and that it truly is, to me, a fundamentally difficult issue, made more so by the attitudes that we have, which are essential human attitudes. When Debbie was pregnant, we didn't call the thing growing in her a fetus. We called it our child. And that's part of this. That's part of a consequence of the society that we live in. People don't have so many children, and we tend to get more attached, and we have more knowledge about the miracle of what's going on. We have photographs that I don't hold the pro-life position, but I do hope that I understand where it is coming from, why somebody would be moved to defend those rights in public, even though they sit across the table from my position. It's my hope that these sorts of things enable us to have conversations that are sensitive and inclusive, and are able to, that permit us to find the things that we do hold in common with each other, despite strong disagreements that we may have about what I feel is a fundamentally difficult issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Rabbi.
It was very informative.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Oops.